Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about the Republican Party that was formed in the 1850s. And again, if you haven't listened to previous episodes, these episodes tell a story and they kind of take us through early American history, the factions, the party. So if you want to do that, please start with episode 124 on Washington's farewell address and what he says about political parties. But Dr. Weinberg, in the last episode, he mentioned Abraham Lincoln. And when I think of the Republican Party in the 1850s and the Republican Party pre-Civil War, I think of Abraham Lincoln. And we are going to do his election later. But why was the Republican Party formed in the 1850s?
Right. So the Republican Party is effectively the survivor of a series of third parties that are organizing around being skeptical of slavery, and particularly slavery's expansion into the territories. I honestly think the best way to understand the Republican Party is you just look at their 1856 party platform. And they say effectively, look, we care about the Constitution, we care about federalism and states' rights, we care about the fidelity here. We agree to disagree on a few parts of economic policy. There's a few things that they do put down and say we want to keep some parts of the old Whig program. But for the most part, they say, I think toward the end, they explicitly say, we just want people who agree with us that the Constitution allows the restriction of slavery in the territories. Like, that's it. That's the one issue that we care about. Do you think that we can stop the expansion of slavery in the territories? Agree to disagree on other things. Lincoln gives a really great speech. It's a little later, but I think that it illustrates this, called the Cooper Union Address, where he effectively says, like, look, people say that we're the radical, crazy party. We're doing all these insane social changes. But he says, actually, we're the conservative party in the sense that what we are calling for is the power of Congress to restrict slavery in the territories, which happened at the Northwest Ordinance, which happened basically at the founding. We are the old model. We are the old set of beliefs. You Democrats that think that slavery is, and I put an asterisk around you Democrats because I'll come back to that, but you folks basically say that we're radicals and crazies and changing things. You're the ones that are now shifted to being pro-slavery instead of reluctantly tolerating slavery. Now you're explicitly pro-slavery. You're the ones that think we need to reinterpret the powers of the federal government in the territorial clause. You're the ones that think we need to modify the interpretation of the due process clause. So now Lincoln originally is not a major player in the Republican Party. He gets prominent because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he's not one of the early leaders. It's folks like Chase, it's folks like Seward, Salmon P. Chase, William Seward, some of whom have been leaders of some of those little splinter parties, the anti-Masonics or the Know-Nothings or the Free Soil and Liberty parties. Now, one thing that I think is worth emphasizing, people will create the narrative and just say the National Republicans, which are the more expansive infrastructure party, turn into the Whigs, turn into the Republicans. That is not correct. If you look at the leadership of the Republican sort of the early cabinets or whatever, you could make a decent case to say most of its leadership is actually old anti-slavery Democrats. Whether you get sort of how you classify people is going to make the difference on whether you actually think it's more or less. But the point is, it's not just all the Whigs become Republicans. It's a faction of Whigs that are slavery skeptical that become Republicans. But at the same time, much of their leadership picks up the old anti-slavery Democrats. So John McClain was the justice who's I'm trying to remember when he leaves the court exactly, whether it's technically when the Republicans are operating or not. But he'd been one of Jackson's nominees to the Supreme Court, right? He didn't view anything being in tension with being anti-slavery and being a Democrat. And there are others that, and Chase is the same way. This is part of why also, after the Civil War, you have a lot of Republicans go back to being Democrats. in the 1870s and 1880s, because they say the Republicans were organized effectively as a one-party issue to initially eliminate slavery in the territories and then to eliminate slavery more broadly as the Civil War goes on. From their perspective, sort of mission accomplished after the Reconstruction Amendments. So now we can go back to fighting about tariffs and strict construction of constitutionalism, et cetera. So the Republican Party at that point sort of has I won't name names, but there are, charities and interest groups that are formed to deal with something. And then if they deal with that thing, they either have the choice of mission accomplished and closing up shop, or they pick a new thing to do. And so the Republican Party in the 1870s and 80s has a sort of existential crisis over what's it going to be organized around. Is it going to be basically a big business faction? Is it going to be once the issue of slavery has originally been dealt with, and then a younger faction of Republicans that basically views the issue as dealt with, even though Jim Crow is starting to pop up in the late 1880s, right? The old guard Republicans say, hey, we got to go back to arms, guys. They're restarting the Civil War in effect. We got to be enforcing this with the Lodge Bill and things. But that faction sort of ends up falling away. And so the Republicans through the 50s, I guess, are still the more sort of civil rights protective party, depending on how you think of what civil rights means, certainly through the 20s, but they're not willing to spend that much political capital on it, even if they'll, attempt a federal anti-lynching law to enforce the 14th Amendment, for example. So organized as a single issue, basically anti-slavery territorial party. And Lincoln is, if you really want to understand them, read their 1856 party platform and read Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he's very explicit. He says, look, I will still enforce the Fugitive Slave Act effectively, or at least I don't think we can just blow it off. He says there's kind of passive aggressive double negative language in who enforces it, passive voice, I should say. But, they're not originally 100% abolitionist party. They just literally want to stop slavery's expansion in the territories. This becomes a problem after Dred Scott, which effectively declares their platform unconstitutional, right? It says that there's a constitutional right to take slaves into the territories. And so this is why, unsurprisingly, the Republican Party is so incandescent with rage against Tawney from their perspective, declaring their party illegal based on a really bad, and we talked about this when we did the Dred Scott episode, so I'm not going to belabor all that, but based on an absolutely appallingly inaccurate reading of constitutional history. So that's how they get built, basically. They're the survivor of the various third parties that are organized as slavery is becoming the big issue. When the Whigs collapse finally, most of them fall into that, as do the leading anti-slavery Democrats.
Dr. Meyerberg, and maybe it's too early in our story to ask this question, but why is it that this party stuck when so many before it kind of just died off?
This is something historians will sort of go back and forth. Did the Civil War sort of have to happen when it did? What's the timeline look like? I don't sort of know necessarily why they outlast, because in the 1854 and 56 elections, there's a whole bunch of different parties, and they're effectively just able to sort of co-opt several of them into just merging into the Republicans. So I don't know enough about sort of the, cloakroom, smoke room deals that were made as to why that one ends up as the survivor. But yeah, it absorbs the leadership. Part of it is that it has more effective leaders in some ways in terms of those kind of negotiations, but I don't know what the structural reason is that it wins, other than it just seemingly has. It's not. I guess I should say, to your question, it's not obvious that in 1855 it's going to be the Republicans that are the one that makes it.
Thank you. And listeners, our next episode, we're going to talk more about how Abraham Lincoln's election changed party politics. Again, we're just continuing to tell the story of political parties in America. Dr. Meyerberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.